You think your grocery bill is high? Complaining about the price of avocados or organic kale? Well, take a step back, way back, about 800 years. Imagine a world with no supermarkets, no refrigerators, no takeout apps. A world where your survival depends entirely on what you can pull from the dirt with your own two hands or what little you can find. This was the reality for medieval peasants. They didn't eat for pleasure, they ate to stay alive. The 15 cheap meals we're about to explore weren't fancy, they weren't Instagram-worthy, but they fueled generations through plague, through famine, and through a life of endless, back-breaking labor. This is the story of the food that built the modern world, one humble, often desperate meal at a time. And right at the very top of that list, the undisputed king of the peasant kitchen, is a dish called pottage. Now, have you ever had that one house guest who shows up for a weekend and is still on your couch 3 weeks later? You know, the one they've just sort of merged with the furniture, becoming a permanent fixture in your home. That's basically what pottage was to the medieval peasant, except they actually wanted it to stick around. This legendary, almost mythical soup was the ultimate waste not, want not dish of the Middle Ages. It simmered endlessly over the hearth fire, like the world's most patient, unassuming dinner, a silent witness to the family's struggles and small triumphs. Pottage wasn't just a soup, it was the soup. It was the absolute cornerstone of medieval peasant nutrition, the original set-it-and-forget-it meal, and a profound reflection of the harsh realities of their lives. Unlike our modern single-serving dinners that are cooked, eaten, and forgotten within an hour, pottage was a deliberate lifestyle. It was a living, evolving entity. The cooking pot, a simple cauldron usually made of iron or clay, rarely ever left the fire. It was a permanent resident of the hearth, the heart of their small, smoky one-room homes. As family members ladled out a serving, new ingredients were tossed in to replace what was taken. Think of it as the medieval version of a never-ending buffet, but with a drastically limited menu and absolutely zero variety. The concept of a fresh pot of soup was a luxury. The pottage was eternal. So, what exactly went into this perpetual stew? Honestly, a better question might be, what didn't? The base was almost always a grain, whatever was cheapest, grew most reliably, and filled the belly the longest. This usually meant barley, oats, or rye. These grains were tossed into the pot with water and boiled for hours, even days, until they broke down into a thick, gloopy, porridge-like consistency. This mush was the canvas. From there, peasants added literally whatever they could get their hands on. Vegetables they grew in their small garden plots were the most common additions: tough turnips, sharp onions, pungent leeks, and hardy cabbage. If they were having a particularly good year, maybe some carrots or peas would make an appearance, adding a rare splash of colour and sweetness. Archaeological studies of medieval food remains have confirmed this practice. One fascinating study found that the average peasant household kept their pottage going for at least 4 days before the pot was scraped clean and a new batch was started. But in many homes, especially during the lean, brutal winter months, families would maintain their pot for much, much longer, adding snowmelt and a handful of dried grains just to keep it going. Dig sites at medieval villages show a clear pattern. As winter dragged on, the variety of ingredients in the pots dwindled dramatically, until what was left was little more than grains and a few sad root vegetables. It was a monotonous, but life-sustaining sludge. Now, it's important to remember that while all social classes ate some form of pottage, there was a vast, almost unimaginable chasm between the peasant's pot and the one bubbling away in a noble's kitchen. Wealthy households transformed pottage into a genuinely luxurious dish. Theirs was enriched with expensive imported spices like saffron and pepper, chunks of beef, venison, or poultry, and sometimes even a splash of wine for flavour and acidity. It was a dish to be savoured. Peasant pottage, meanwhile, had to rely on whatever local herbs they could forage for flavour. A bit of wild garlic, some parsley, maybe some sage, whatever grew in the hedgerows or could be cultivated in a corner of the garden. On very special occasions, maybe a wedding, a holiday, or after a successful bit of poaching, a peasant family might experience a moment of true culinary excitement. They might drop a small piece of salt pork or a strip of bacon into their pottage pot. This wasn't enough meat for anyone to actually get a piece in their bowl. That wasn't the point. The goal was for the fat to melt and render out, infusing the entire pot with a savoury, smoky flavour. That precious fat would rise to the top, providing a desperately needed source of calories during times of hard labor. Some historians believe that the average medieval peasant consumed as much as 2 to 3 pints of pottage every single day. It was their breakfast, their lunch, and their dinner. It was the true fuel of the feudal system. It may not have been a meal worth posting on social media, but its humble, persistent presence kept countless generations alive through centuries of unimaginable hardship. But as central as the never-ending soup was, it was rarely eaten alone. It needed a partner, a dense, heavy companion that formed the other pillar of medieval survival. Pottage may have been the never-ending soup of medieval times, but it was rarely a solo act. It needed a partner, a dense and dependable co-star to make a complete meal. That partner was bread. Bread connects us all, doesn't it? From the most ancient civilizations to our modern kitchens, it remains the world's most universal food. But I need you to forget everything you know about bread. Forget fluffy white sandwich loaves. Forget artisanal sourdough with a perfect crust. Forget warm, buttery dinner rolls. The loaves that graced medieval peasant tables would make most of us today turn up our noses in disbelief. Medieval peasant bread was dark, it was dense, and it was often as hard and unforgiving as the lives of the people who baked it. The primary difference started with the grain itself. This was not the golden wheat that made the fine, white manchet bread for the nobility. Peasants made their bread primarily from rye or barley, and occasionally oats. These were tough, resilient grains, the workhorses of the medieval field. They could grow in poor, rocky soil where delicate wheat would struggle and fail. This wasn't a choice of taste. It was a choice of survival. The best, most fertile lands on a manor were reserved for the lord's cash crops, which was almost always wheat destined for the tables of the wealthy. The peasants were left with the marginal lands, and on those lands, rye and barley were what grew. These grains produced a bread that was naturally darker, heavier, and had a much stronger, almost sour flavour compared to wheat. But the grain for peasant bread wasn't just different. The entire process was a gauntlet of hardship and expense. First, the grain they harvested was often of poor quality, mixed with weed seeds, dirt, and chaff. Then came the first tax on their survival, the mill. Peasants were legally forbidden from owning their own handmills. They were required to take their grain to the lord's mill to have it ground, and for this privilege, the miller, who worked for the lord, would take a hefty portion of the flour as payment a fee known as the multure. This could be as much as 1/16 of their entire harvest, a devastating loss for a family living on the edge. To save on these costs, and to stretch their precious flour supply as far as possible, many would mix in fillers. And this is where things get truly desperate. Ground peas and beans were common additions, as were ground acorns and chestnuts after they had been leached of their bitter tannins. But in the leanest of times, the fillers became a testament to human desperation. Ground tree bark, sawdust, and even straw were mixed into the dough. Imagine trying to chew, let alone digest, a loaf of bread made partially from tree bark. So just how much of this dense, filler-laden bread did the average peasant eat? The numbers are absolutely staggering. Historical records from medieval England show that a working man in the fields might consume 2 or 3 pounds of bread every single day. That's not a typo. 2 to 3 pounds. This provided over 60% of their total calories. Women and children ate proportionally similar amounts. This wasn't gluttony. It was fuel. The heavy, relentless labor of medieval farming, ploughing by hand, scything fields, digging ditches required a massive caloric intake, and dense, heavy bread delivered those calories cheaply and effectively. It was the energy bar of the Middle Ages. The baking process itself was another stark reminder of the class divisions of medieval society. Wealthy households had their own private ovens and enjoyed fresh bread daily. Peasants had no such luxury. Their simple wattle and daub huts had no ovens, which were expensive to build and a serious fire hazard. Instead, they typically baked just once a week, either in communal village ovens, which they also had to pay a fee to use, or they fashioned simple, unleavened flatbreads that could be cooked on a hearthstone over the fire. These large weekly loaves were designed for longevity, not for taste. As the days passed, they grew progressively harder and staler. By the end of the week, the loaf could be as hard as a brick, requiring a good, long dunk in pottage or ale simply to become edible again. The mould that inevitably grew on the crust would be scraped off, a grim routine of medieval life. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval bread was its potential to be a deadly poison. Rye, the peasant grain of choice in many regions of Europe, was particularly susceptible to a fungus called claviceps purpurea, more commonly known as ergot. This fungus, which grew on the rye kernels, contained psychoactive compounds similar to LSD. When peasants unknowingly ground this infected rye into flour and baked it into bread, entire villages could be afflicted with a condition known as ergotism, or Street Anthony's fire. The symptoms were horrific. Victims felt an agonizing, burning sensation in their limbs, as if they were on fire from the inside out. This was often followed by convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene, which caused their fingers, toes, and even entire limbs to wither, turn black, and fall off. They couldn't know that their daily bread, the very staff of life, was the source of this hellish torment. And yet, for all its dangers, for all its deficiencies and its rock-hard texture, bread was sacred in medieval culture. Stealing a loaf of bread was punished with extreme severity. Wasting even a crumb was considered a profound sin. The medieval table began with bread, and ended with bread. When famine struck, as it regularly did, families might survive for weeks on bread alone, even as the definition of bread became increasingly creative and desperate. But what happened when even the acorns and tree bark ran out? What did they eat when the flour bin was truly empty, and the weekly loaf was just a memory? That's when they turned to a food that was one step above eating nothing at all. After a long day working the fields, there was nothing to put on the bread. In fact, there was no bread at all. The grain bin is empty, the weekly loaf is gone, and the never-ending pottage has dwindled to a watery memory. What then? In medieval cuisine, the grim answer was gruel. Gruel was essentially one small step above consuming boiled water with a spoon. When bread became a distant luxury, and the ingredients for pottage had long since vanished, gruel stepped in as the final desperate defense against an empty, aching stomach. The famous literary line, "Please, sir, I want some more," is forever linked with the image of a sad bowl of gruel. But for medieval peasants, there was rarely the luxury of asking for seconds, or even having a filling first portion. Gruel was survival food, plain and brutally simple. It was defined not by what it contained, but by what it lacked. It's crucial to distinguish it from its heartier cousins. Pottage, as we've seen, was a thick, evolving stew, often containing a variety of vegetables and grains. Porridge was a proper meal, a substantial amount of grain, like oats or barley, boiled in water or even milk until thick and satisfying. Gruel was the sad, watery ghost of porridge. It was a dish born of deliberate thinness, its entire purpose being to stretch a minuscule amount of ingredients to their absolute physical limit. The recipe, if you can even call it that, couldn't be simpler and is a testament to its bleak origins. You would take whatever scraps of grain remained in the bottom of the storage bin, oats, barley, maybe even flour swept from the floor. You'd add a large, disproportionate amount of water until the mixture looked hopelessly thin, then cook it over the fire until it thickened just enough to resemble something edible. If you were experiencing a moment of incredible fortune, you might have a single pinch of salt to stir into the entire pot. That was it. The result was a watery, bland, translucent substance that filled the hollow space in the belly without satisfying any other human desire for flavor, texture, or joy. Medieval records paint a stark picture of gruel's role during the frequent and devastating famines. Historians have found documents from monasteries that were feeding the poor, detailing how they would stretch a single cup of oats into enough gruel to serve 10 starving people. Let's just do the math on that. A single cup is about 16 tablespoons. Divided among 10 people, that works out to less than 2 tablespoons of grain per person. It was hardly a meal by any standard we would recognize today. It was a nutritional prayer, a meager offering meant to trick the body into feeling full for just a few more hours. Interestingly, gruel wasn't exclusively for the desperately poor. Monks all across medieval Europe regularly consumed gruel as a central part of their religious practice, a tool for cultivating humility and disciplining the body. Kitchen records from a 12th century monastery show that monks ate gruel during prescribed fasting periods, with one abbey documenting the consumption of gruel twice daily for the entire 40 days of Lent. Now, their bowls might occasionally include a drizzle of honey or a few dried fruits luxuries that an ordinary peasant could only dream of. But the base was the same thin, humble substance. It was a conscious choice to embrace the food of the destitute as a path to spiritual purity. For the sick and the elderly, gruel became the default mode of medieval healthcare. For those too ill to chew hard bread or too weak to digest a hearty pottage, gruel was the prescribed diet until they either recovered or they didn't. Medieval medical texts, known as leech books, frequently recommend gruel for a wide range of ailments, from fevers to toothaches. They often suggest additions like specific herbs or a splash of wine for medicinal purposes. But of course, peasants rarely had access to these fancy, curative versions. Their medicinal gruel was the same as their famine gruel. It was also the first solid food for infants. Children weaning from breast milk often transitioned directly to gruel, creating generations of Europeans who never knew the concept of specialized baby food. Court records from medieval England occasionally mention the tragic cases of children who died of malnutrition, despite being fed gruel regularly, a grim reminder of its profound nutritional inadequacy. And the taste? Well, it was about what you'd expect. Contemporary accounts describe it as thin, watery, and occasionally slimy, hardly a ringing endorsement. One medieval writer, in a moment of cutting honesty, noted that even the dogs turn from it, unless truly starving, which tells you everything you need to know about its appeal. When even the grain to make this desperate, slimy soup became too luxurious, peasants had to turn to another reliable crop, a humble root that thrived in poor soil and could be stored through the long, dark winter. When even gruel became too much of a luxury due to grain shortages, medieval peasants turned to another reliable crop, a vegetable that has since been forgotten by modern cuisine, but once reigned supreme in the kitchens of the poor. While today's shoppers might walk right past them in the produce aisle without a second glance, these humble roots kept countless people alive through centuries of hardship. I'm talking about the turnip. The forgotten, unglamorous, and absolutely essential turnip was the unsung hero of the medieval peasant's garden. What made the turnip so indispensable to medieval survival? It basically had a set of agricultural superpowers. First, it was incredibly tough. Turnips grew almost anywhere. Got poor, rocky soil where nothing else would sprout? Turnips thrived. Facing a short growing season before the first frost? Turnips could manage. Didn't have time for careful watering and tending because you were busy working the Lord's fields? Turnips forgave the neglect. This resilience made them the perfect crop for the marginal lands that peasants were typically allowed to farm for themselves. A single turnip seed, a tiny black speck, could yield a massive root, with some varieties producing up to 15 pounds of food. This made them one of the most efficient and high-yield crops a peasant could possibly plant in their small garden plot. Turnip stew became the medieval equivalent of fast food. It was quick, it was filling, and it was available almost year-round. The basic recipe required a level of minimal effort that even the most exhausted peasant could muster at the end of a 14-hour workday. You chop the turnips, you add water, you boil them until they're soft, and you season with salt if you're lucky enough to have any. That's it. No fancy techniques, no rare ingredients, just pure, unadulterated sustenance. Its second superpower was storage. Long before refrigeration, the ability to store food through the winter was the literal difference between life and death. And the turnip was a storage champion. After the autumn harvest, peasants stored turnips in cool, dry cellars where they would remain perfectly edible for months. Some villages even dug specialized turnip pits, which were essentially underground storage chambers lined with straw. In these pits, turnips could be kept fresh from the harvest all the way through the winter until late spring. There's an incredible record from one English manor in 1286, which noted that the turnips stored in this way fed the village families for a full 7 months after the harvest. Imagine the profound sense of security that a deep pit full of turnips provided against the coming cold and darkness. Furthermore, unlike many other vegetables, the entire turnip was edible, embodying the waste-not philosophy of the medieval kitchen. The main root, of course, went into stews or was roasted in the embers of the fire. The leafy green tops were a valuable source of vitamins and were added to the ever-present pottage. Even the flowers that sprouted in the spring could be eaten. Nothing ever went to waste. Medieval field records suggest that an average family of 4 needed to grow about 200 pounds of turnips to survive the winter, a goal that was surprisingly achievable in a small garden plot, thanks to the turnip's high yield. The humble turnip even played a significant role in medieval medicine. Folk healers and village-wise women would prescribe turnip juice for persistent coughs and turnip poultices for skin ailments and infections. One fascinating text from a monastery's medical library claims that turnips could drive away winter melancholy, which was perhaps an early, intuitive recognition of the nutritional benefits of fresh vegetables during the vitamin-scarce winter months, a primitive understanding of how diet affects mood. Of course, eating turnips day after day, week after week, month after month had its serious downsides. Medieval writers and poets would occasionally complain about the crushing sameness of peasant meals, with one noting with bleak humour that the poor eat turnips until their skin takes on the pallor of the root itself. Another drawback was less aesthetic and far more aromatic. Turnips, especially when boiled and reheated repeatedly in a small, poorly ventilated hut, developed a distinctive and pervasive sulphurous smell that would have permeated every piece of clothing and every corner of the home. For all their benefits, turnips were never considered celebration food. They were a symbol of poverty and hardship. When asked in a hypothetical question what kind of magnificent feast he would prepare if he were suddenly made wealthy, a medieval peasant reportedly answered, "The same turnips, but with meat." This simple, humble aspiration speaks volumes about the culinary reality of the time. The turnip was the baseline, the default, the ever-present reality of their diet. But while turnips may have dominated the medieval table, they rarely appeared alone. Another vegetable duo frequently joined them, creating a trio of flavors that, while simple, offered both nutrition and a welcome, if pungent, break from turnip monotony. Could two vegetables clear out a medieval peasant hut faster than the plague? Cabbage and onions certainly tried their best. This famously odorous duo formed the backbone of peasant cooking all across Europe, adding a much-needed punch of flavor to otherwise bland and monotonous meals, while simultaneously testing the absolute limits of medieval ventilation. While the turnip provided the starchy bulk for survival, it was cabbage and onions that made that survival just a little more palatable. They were the dependable, pungent partners that, along with the turnip, formed the true holy trinity of the peasant's garden. Cabbage, in particular, earned its coveted spot in peasant gardens by being absurdly productive and versatile. A single cabbage plant could become a behemoth, with some medieval varieties growing heads that weighed up to 15 pounds. Old agricultural records show that as few as 10 of these massive cabbage plants could provide a substantial amount of food for a family for months, all while taking up very little precious garden space. Even more ingeniously, cabbage offered a continuous harvest. The outer leaves could be picked and added to the pottage pot throughout the growing season, while the central head kept right on growing. It was like a food source that slowly replaced itself as you ate it, an invaluable trait when every meal was uncertain. But it was the preservation of cabbage that made it a true winter lifesaver. Fresh cabbage could last for several weeks in a cool cellar, but soured cabbage, what we now call sauerkraut, could keep for months on end. Archaeologists have discovered ancient cabbage pits in the remains of medieval villages, where communities would layer shredded cabbage and salt to ferment. One excavated pit from a 1300s village in Germany contained the fossilized remnants of over 100 cabbages preserved together. That was enough to provide several families with a vital source of vitamins and flavor all winter long, long after fresh vegetables were a distant memory. They didn't know about vitamin C, but they knew that eating sauerkraut in February kept the mysterious illnesses of winter at bay. Onions worked in perfect, pungent harmony with cabbage in the medieval culinary world. They were tough, hard to kill, and could grow in the most pathetic, nutrient-poor dirt. Just as importantly, they stored effortlessly without any special pits or cellars. Peasants would simply braid their green tops together and hang them from the rafters of their huts, where they would last for months. Old gardening guides, or herbals, advised peasants to plant onions around the borders of other crops, as their strong smell naturally deterred pests. This made them doubly useful in the small, intensive peasant gardens, where every single plant had to justify its existence. Together, these two vegetables transformed plain, boiled sustenance into something with actual flavor. Boiled together with a little salt, they made a simple but satisfying side dish. Tossed into the pottage pot, they added a deep, savory foundation that no amount of barley or oats could provide on its own. If a family was lucky enough to have a tiny scrap of bacon or a spoonful of rendered fat, it was almost always used to fry up some onions and cabbage, creating a dish that, by peasant standards, was a veritable feast. Their value was so recognized that old tax records sometimes list cabbage and onions as acceptable payment for small debts or rents, showing how they were viewed as a staple commodity, almost like a form of currency. Of course, the well-known digestive consequences of this diet were a fact of life. The gassy aftermath of a cabbage and onion-heavy meal was notorious. Old court records from various villages across Europe amusingly document minor disputes and public disturbances caused by the ill winds and foul airs resulting from cabbage-heavy meals. One rule in a Benedictine monastery explicitly banned cabbage from the menu on days when the monks were expecting important visitors, strongly hinting that the subsequent flatulence wasn't considered conducive to polite, pious company. Oddly enough, while peasants relied on these vegetables for their very lives, the educated physicians of the nobility were deeply suspicious of them. The doctors who attended to wealthy lords and ladies often warned them against eating base plants of the poor like cabbage and onions, claiming they caused melancholy, sluggish thinking, and an imbalance of the bodily humours. Meanwhile, the poor folks eating these vegetables every day, while certainly not living a life of luxury, were subsisting on a diet far richer in fibre and certain vitamins than their noble overlords. For all their benefits, however, cabbage and onions couldn't supply everything a hard-working peasant needed. A diet of only these vegetables, even with bread and pottage, was critically low on protein. Medieval peasants knew this by instinct, if not by science, which led them to seek out this crucial macronutrient wherever they could find it. Medieval folks didn't have protein shakes or energy bars, but they did have mushy peas and beans. These humble crops were the quiet, everyday heroes of the peasant diet, the unglamorous but essential source of protein that provided the real strength needed for long, grueling days of hard labor in the fields. While bread and turnips provided the raw calories, the fuel to keep the engine running, peas and beans were the components that built and repaired the engine itself. They offered what bread and cabbage simply couldn't: dense, plant-based protein. Dried peas, for example, contained about 25% protein by weight, a nutritional density that made them practically worth their weight in gold during the long winter months when meat was scarce or, for most peasants, completely non-existent. A small patch of land dedicated to growing peas could yield up to 60 pounds of dried peas. Once dried, these legumes were like little nuggets of nutritional insurance that could be stored for years, a promise of a filling meal tucked away in a clay pot. For a family constantly living on the brink, that was a security that was hard to overstate. Growing these protein-packed foods was simple enough, even for the most overburdened farmers, and they came with a bonus feature that felt like agricultural magic. Peas and beans are nitrogen fixers. In simple terms, they pull nitrogen from the air and store it in their roots, enriching the soil rather than depleting it. This meant they could grow in fields where other crops had already used up all the good stuff. Smart peasants practiced a form of intuitive, sustainable agriculture, planting peas and beans between rows of other vegetables or in a field after a grain harvest. They were getting a whole extra crop of high-protein food from the same patch of land, while simultaneously making that land more fertile for the next year's planting. It was a win-win situation, dictated by necessity. The most common way to eat these legumes was in the form of a thick, mashed paste, often called peas pottage or peas pudding. The process was simple and required little attention. Dried peas or beans, which were as hard as little rocks, were soaked overnight to soften them. The next day they were boiled for hours until they were completely soft, then mashed into a thick, dense paste. Salt was added if it was available, and maybe some wild herbs foraged from the forest edge if they were lucky. The result probably looked a lot like unappealing baby food, a thick, often greyish-green or brown sludge, but it packed a nutritional punch that could keep a worker going through a 12-hour day of swinging a scythe. During the harshest of times, this pea and bean mash became the main meal rather than just a side dish. Old records from one English village during the Great Famine of 1315, a truly apocalyptic period of cold, rain and failed harvests, note that entire families survived for weeks on nothing but pea mash and small beer, with bread itself becoming an unattainable luxury. Monks across Europe also relied heavily on these humble foods. The strict rules of the church banned meat on many days of the year: Fridays, the whole of Lent, and numerous other saints' days and vigils. In some monastic orders, this could amount to more than half the calendar year. This made peas and beans absolutely vital to the monastery kitchens. The account books from one large abbey in England show that they stocked over 3,000 pounds of dried peas annually for a community of just 40 monks. That's a staggering 75 pounds of dried peas per monk, per year. It underscores just how central these legumes were, not just as peasant food, but as a staple for even the most organised and well-supplied institutions. But, just like their odorous partners, cabbage and onions, These foods had a well-known downside. They caused gas. Medieval health guides explicitly warned against eating too many beans before attending church services or appearing in court, for obvious reasons. There's a wonderful old medieval joke that tells of a bean farmer who was travelling to market, but couldn't sell his crop because he'd tested too much of his own product along the way and had driven away all his potential customers. While peas and beans kept peasants alive and healthy enough to work, they weren't exactly exciting. Day after day, the same bland mash could be soul-crushing. Medieval peasants still craved variety and, more than anything else, the rich, savoury taste of meat. Whenever they had the chance to add it to their cooking pots, they jumped at the opportunity. But that opportunity almost never came from a prime cut. Eat what you can get. This was the golden rule of medieval meat-eating for the poor. While nobles and wealthy merchants dined on roasted venison, fat capons and entire swans presented at the table, peasants made do with the bits and pieces nobody else wanted. The organs, the feet, the heads, and all the odd scraps that today we call offal. The term itself comes from offal, literally the parts that would fall off the butcher's block as the prime cuts were prepared. For the wealthy, this was waste. For the peasant, it was a precious, protein-rich meal. Animal butchering in medieval times followed a strict, unwritten hierarchy that dictated who got what parts. The lord of the manor, by right, claimed the best cuts, the tenderloins, the plump breasts, and the meaty haunches. Townspeople with a bit of money could buy the decent middle-grade pieces from the butcher. What remained for the peasants who had likely raised the animal in the first place? Everything else. But medieval peasants were absolute masters of culinary alchemy, capable of turning these humble scraps into food that was not only edible but genuinely worth eating. Take the humble pig's head. After a pig slaughter, a peasant family might receive the head as partial payment for their work. In their hands, nothing went unused. The head would be slowly simmered or roasted over the fire. The cheeks provided small but incredibly tender and flavorful portions of meat. The ears would be cleaned, sliced, and fried until they were crispy. A medieval version of pork rinds. The snout and lips, rich in collagen, were boiled down to make a gelatinous dish known as head cheese. Even the brain was carefully scooped out, scrambled with wild herbs, and considered a delicacy. A single pig's head could provide several different meals for a family. Larger animals like cows provided even more offal options. The stomach, after a thorough and unpleasant cleaning process, became tripe, or it could be used as the container for haggis-like mixtures. These weren't just a Scottish specialty. Similar dishes were found across Europe. The stomach would be stuffed with the animal's other organs, the heart, liver, and lungs, collectively known as the pluck, all chopped finely and mixed with oats or barley and herbs. It was a perfect, self-contained meal that used up all the most perishable parts at once. Blood from any slaughtered animal was a precious resource, far too valuable to be discarded. It was immediately collected in a bucket and mixed with grain and seasonings to create blood pudding, or black pudding, which was then stuffed into a casing made from a cleaned intestine and boiled or fried. Game animals too small or insignificant for the Lord's grand table often ended up in peasant cooking pots. While poaching a deer from the Lord's forest could get a man hanged, trapping smaller creatures was a common practice. Whole squirrels, hedgehogs, and rabbits provided tiny but vital portions of meat that could flavor an otherwise plain vegetable dish for an entire family. In times of true desperation, like famine or siege, records mention peasants trapping and eating badgers, foxes, and even rats. The unwritten rule was simple. If it moves and it can't kill you, it's food. This waste-nothing approach was essential for stretching a tiny amount of animal protein to feed as many mouths as possible. The organs from a single cow could provide supplementary meals for several families, while the prime cuts from that same cow would feed just one noble household for a day or two. Court records reveal just how valuable these scraps were considered. The theft of offal was punished severely, sometimes with the same penalties as stealing the more valuable cuts. One medieval English town recorded fining a man for stealing a single sheep's pluck, the heart, liver, and lungs. The fine was equal to 2 weeks' wages. Preservation techniques for offal were necessarily quick and frantic. Without refrigeration, organs spoiled with terrifying rapidity. Smoking, heavy salting, and immediate cooking were the only options. Because of this, many offal dishes became intrinsically linked to butchering days. They were eaten within hours of the animal's slaughter in an almost ceremonial feast of necessity, a rare and welcome bounty for the entire community. But for those living near the coasts or major rivers, another source of animal protein was far more accessible, even if it came with its own unique set of challenges. Medieval folks didn't have drive-thrus or delivery apps, but they absolutely had their own version of fast food. It was the original grab-and-go meal, ready to eat without any cooking, packed with protein, and with a shelf life that would make modern food scientists jealous. But it came with a catch. It was packed with enough salt to make your eyes water and leave you thirsty for days. This was the world of salted herring, the ubiquitous, stinky, and utterly essential fast food of the Middle Ages. Herring became the fish of choice for the entirety of medieval Europe, from coastal villages to landlocked mountain towns, for three very simple reasons. First, they were incredibly abundant. Herring swim in enormous, dense groups called shoals, making them ridiculously easy to catch with simple nets. Second, they were oily, which meant they took to salt preservation exceptionally well. And third, that preservation method was cheap and effective. Fishing records from the era show just how colossal the herring industry was. During the peak season, a single fishing fleet from the English town of Great Yarmouth could haul in more than 40 million herring in just a few weeks. To put that in perspective, that's enough fish to give every single man, woman and child in medieval England about 7 fish each. On the other side of the North Sea, the small Baltic island of Scania was a processing powerhouse, handling more than 300 million herring annually in its peak years. This wasn't just fishing, it was an industrial-scale operation. The salt preservation process was a race against time and a full-on assault on the senses. Fresh herring spoils within a day, so the work had to begin the moment the nets were pulled from the water. Fishing boats often carried barrels of salt on board, and workers would immediately gut the fish, pack them in heavy layers of coarse salt, and seal them in wooden barrels right there on the deck. The smell was notoriously strong. The areas of medieval towns dedicated to herring processing had their own districts, always situated safely downwind from where most people lived. It was an overpowering, inescapable stench of fish, guts, and brine, but for the people of the time, it was the smell of survival and commerce. For the average peasant, salted herring was the answer to a multitude of food problems. First, and most importantly, it solved the meat ban during religious fasting days. As we've mentioned, the church banned meat on all Fridays, during the 40 days of Lent, and on many other holy days, sometimes totaling more than half the year. Fish, however, remained permissible. This made herring a crucial source of protein for huge chunks of the calendar. Second, herring could travel. Unlike fresh fish, which couldn't make it more than a few miles from the coast without spoiling, barrels of salted herring could journey deep into the heart of the continent. Trade records show these barrels moving hundreds of miles by cart and boat, reaching remote farms and mountain villages where a fresh sea fish was something you might only ever hear about in stories. It was a vital link in the food chain that connected coastal economies with inland populations. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the peasant, no cooking was needed. While fresh herring would need to be cooked over a fire, the heavily salted version could be eaten as is. This was the ultimate convenience food. For a peasant working in the fields from dawn until dusk, a quick meal of hard bread and a chunk of salted herring saved precious time and, just as importantly, precious fuel for the fire. The cheapest herring came white, which meant it was simply gutted and packed in brine. Those with a little more money to spare might buy red herring, which were salted and then smoked for days until they turned a reddish-brown color and developed a much stronger, smokier flavor. The smoking process also made them last even longer and drew out some of the moisture, making them slightly less salty. Just how many herring did medieval Europeans eat? The numbers from monastic records are mind-boggling. One monastery in York, England, bought 15,000 herring yearly to feed just 30 monks. That's 500 fish per monk, per year, or more than one herring every single day for every single monk. Of course, eating incredibly salty fish day after day got boring fast. Medieval cooks found ways to make it more interesting, like soaking the fish in water or milk for hours to draw out the salt before cooking, chopping it into spreads to put on bread, or baking it into savory pies. But no matter how they prepared it, herring breath remained an occupational hazard of being medieval. After a salty meal like that, peasants needed something to wash it down with, and their drink of choice was almost never water. After a salty meal of preserved herring, a medieval peasant needed something to wash it down with, and their drink of choice was almost never water. In our modern world, we take clean drinking water for granted, but in medieval times, water could be deadly. Public wells were often dug perilously close to cesspits and outhouses, contaminating the groundwater. Rivers and streams frequently caught the sewage and waste from upstream towns and villages. Most people had no idea that invisible microbes in dirty water could make you sick. They just knew through brutal, repeated experience that people who drank from certain water sources often fell violently ill, while those who stuck to ale generally stayed healthy. The brewing process accidentally and brilliantly solved this problem. Boiling the water to create the wort for the ale killed off most of the harmful bacteria and pathogens. Then, the introduction of yeast and the fermentation process, which produced alcohol, helped to prevent new germs from growing. Medieval people didn't understand the microbiology, of course. They didn't know about germ theory. They just saw the results clearly enough. Ale drinkers were healthier and lived longer than water drinkers. It was one of the most important public health discoveries in history, made entirely by accident. Now, when we talk about medieval ale, you need to erase the image of a strong, high-alcohol pint from a modern pub. The everyday drink was a small ale or small beer, which contained just enough alcohol to preserve it, typically only about 1% to 3%, similar to a modern light beer. This weak, watery brew was the all-day, everyday drink for everyone, and that includes children. Yes, medieval kids drank ale with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But they weren't stumbling around drunk. It was viewed less as an intoxicant and more like a safe, nutritious, and flavorful alternative to water. Just how much ale did the average person drink? The numbers found in medieval records are astounding. Many adult laborers, like farmhands or construction workers, received a daily allowance of a gallon of ale as part of their wages. That's 8 pints a day. Manor account books show that during the intense labor of the harvest season, this allowance might increase to 1.5 gallons. It's no wonder medieval workers seemed to take so many breaks during the day. They had a lot of liquid to process. Brewing was almost exclusively women's work, a domestic chore done right at home. The alewife or brewster was a common figure in every village. The basic recipe was simple. Heat water, add malted grain, usually barley or oats, let it steep, strain out the grain, add some herbs for flavor. A mixture called gruit was used before hops became widespread, and then let it ferment in a large wooden tub. Most women brewed a new batch once or twice a week for their family's needs. Ale spoiled quickly without refrigeration, usually within a week, which meant it was a truly local food, made and consumed within the same community. It also meant brewing was a constant, necessary chore for medieval households, as regular and essential as making bread. Speaking of which, ale and bread were intimate partners in the medieval kitchen. Both relied on grain, and both used yeast for fermentation. Many households made them in tandem on baking and brewing days. Leftover ale that was starting to turn could be used as the liquid in bread dough, adding flavor and nutrients. Meanwhile, the yeasty dregs from a loaf of bread could be used to kickstart the fermentation for the next batch of ale. As always, nothing went to waste. Ale even served as a form of payment. Medieval work records show that many tasks were rewarded with a combination of money and ale. Building a section of the village wall might earn you 3 pence plus 2 gallons of ale. Church bell ringers were often paid in ale rather than coins. One English village famously paid its official rat catcher with a weekly jug, perhaps to help him forget the grim realities of his job. For special occasions and celebrations, however, peasants might get to enjoy drinks that were a little stronger, a little sweeter, and offered a more potent kick. The contrast between a medieval peasant sipping cider and today's folks buying expensive craft cocktails couldn't be more striking. But while cider and its even rarer cousin, mead, were certainly treats for the poor, they weren't frivolous luxury items. They were practical, ingenious solutions to food storage problems, and were some of the only sources of genuine sweetness in an otherwise bland and savoury diet. If small ale was the hydrating fuel of the workday, cider and mead were the drinks of celebration, community, and a welcome escape from daily troubles. Cider became the drink of choice in regions where apples grew well. In parts of western England, northern France, and Spain, the climate and soil were far better suited to orchards than to vast grain fields. For a peasant farmer, apple trees had some major advantages. Once planted, a tree would produce fruit for decades with minimal care. Even better, They could be grown on hillsides, too steep for regular crops, or in the corners of fields, making use of otherwise wasted land. In these cider-making regions, almost every peasant household had rights to the fruit from at least a few apple trees. The process of making cider involved simple tools and basic natural steps. In the autumn, peasants collected the apples, often windfalls that weren't good enough to eat. They would crush them in simple wooden presses, or even just by pounding them with mallets in a trough. They collected the resulting juice, or must, and simply left it in barrels to ferment. The magic was that no extra ingredients were needed. The wild yeasts naturally present on the apple skins would immediately go to work, starting the fermentation process all on their own. After a few weeks, the sweet, non-alcoholic juice had transformed into a mildly alcoholic drink that could keep for months, far longer than the fresh apples themselves would have ever lasted. Strong cider contained about 4% to 8% alcohol, enough to create a pleasant buzz after a few cups, but not so strong that workers couldn't function the next day. This stronger brew was carefully rationed and saved for special occasions like weddings, saints' days, and the all-important harvest festivals. Weaker versions, made from the second pressing of the apples, were more like the everyday small ale. Mead offered an even sweeter, and much more ancient, escape from the drudgery of daily life. Made by fermenting honey with water, mead was the oldest known alcoholic drink in Europe, predating even wine and beer. For the average peasant, however, honey was an expensive and difficult to get luxury, making mead far rarer than ale or cider. Most peasants would only taste mead a few times a year, typically at major celebrations like Christmas and Easter, or perhaps at a lord's wedding feast. Some clever and enterprising peasants kept their own beehives, providing a personal source of honey for both sweetening food and making small, precious batches of mead. These weren't the white box hives we know today, but simple skeps made of coiled straw or hollowed-out logs, placed in a sunny spot near flowering plants. A single, well-managed hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey in a year, an incredible treasure for a peasant family. It was enough to make a few gallons of mead and still have some honey left over for other uses. Both cider and mead served a crucial practical purpose beyond just tasting good. The alcohol produced during fermentation acted as a preservative, keeping the natural sugars in the apples and honey stable for far longer than they would have lasted on their own. In an age without refrigeration, turning sweet things into alcohol was one of the smartest storage solutions available. Medieval kitchen records show that cider could last 6 months to a year if stored in a cool cellar, while properly made mead could last for several years, improving with age. These sweet drinks also provided valuable calories during hard times. When bread supplies ran low, a cup of cider or mead delivered a quick burst of energy. Records from one English village during a food shortage mention adults drinking cider as a meal replacement when their grain supplies had dwindled to nothing. Speaking of sweetness, while honey made mead possible, it also served many other purposes in the medieval kitchen, joining forces with another rare treat to provide fleeting moments of joy. For a medieval peasant, sugar wasn't something you'd find in a bowl on the table. In fact, most peasants would live their entire lives without ever tasting it. Refined sugar, imported at incredible expense from the Middle East, was a commodity so rare and valuable that it was sold by the ounce in apothecaries, treated more like a medicine or an exotic spice than a foodstuff. It remained firmly in the realm of kings and the ultra-wealthy. For the common folk, sweetness came directly from nature, in the form of precious honey and fleeting wild berries. These weren't everyday foods. They were rare treats that brightened an otherwise dull and savory diet. Honey stood as the undisputed king of sweeteners in the medieval world. Unlike sugar, it could be produced locally, though not without significant risk and effort. The bravest peasants would engage in the dangerous work of wild honey gathering. This involved tracking bees back to their hives, which were often located high in hollow trees or on rocky cliff faces. The gatherer would then have to subdue the colony, usually with smoke from a smouldering torch, before cutting out the heavy, wax-laden honeycombs. This process often resulted in a barrage of painful stings, but the reward's sticky, fragrant liquid gold made the pain worthwhile. Some clever peasants took beekeeping a step further. Old farming guides describe simple beehives made from hollowed-out logs, coiled straw baskets called skeps, or even large clay pots. These would be placed in sunny spots near flowering plants or orchards. A well-managed hive was an incredible asset, sometimes listed in wills and marriage contracts alongside land and livestock, demonstrating its immense value. A single hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey yearly, an almost unimaginable luxury for a peasant family. Honey did much more than just sweeten food. It was a cornerstone of medieval folk medicine. Its natural antibacterial properties made it an excellent salve for healing wounds and burns. Mixed with herbs, it was used to create syrups to soothe persistent coughs. Its preservative qualities also made it a perfect medium for storing other medicines. But its uses went beyond the medicinal. Honey's stickiness made it a primitive kind of hair gel for setting elaborate hairstyles for special occasions. When mixed with other ingredients, it was even used as a form of depilatory wax for removing unwanted body hair. These multiple uses made honey all the more precious to those lucky enough to have it. When a tiny bit of honey was available, peasants used it with incredible care. A single drop might be stirred into a child's morning porridge. The thinnest possible layer might be spread on a piece of bread as a special treat. The value placed on it was immense. Court records from one medieval English village mention a woman who was accused of stealing a single honey pot. Her punishment was nearly as severe as if she'd stolen a cow. Wild berries provided seasonal bursts of sweetness that required only the labor of gathering. Strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries, all smaller and often tarter than our modern cultivated varieties, grew wild in forests, along riverbanks, and in the hedgerows between fields. They were free for anyone with the time and patience to pick them. Unlike honey, fresh berries couldn't be easily preserved without sugar, so they remained a strictly seasonal delicacy. Berry picking became a community activity, with women and children often sent out in groups to gather these precious fruits for the few weeks a year they were available. The ultimate peasant dessert, the dream of a lifetime for many, was the combination of these two rare treats. When a lord wanted to truly impress his guests, dishes featuring honey and berries might appear at the end of a feast. For a peasant lucky enough to be invited to such a rare event, tasting a honey-sweetened berry dessert might be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. There's a wonderful old joke that perfectly captures this desire. A peasant is asked what he would do if he were made king for just one day. He doesn't wish for power or riches. He replies simply, "I would eat berries with honey until my belly ached." That simple, heartfelt dream tells you everything you need to know about how rare and coveted this combination was for ordinary people. When berries weren't in season and the honey pot was empty, peasants had to find other ways to fill their bellies, sometimes turning to the forest floor itself for their staples. Maybe the squirrels were onto something after all. When the grain harvests failed, when the vegetable patch withered, and when famine stalked the land, medieval peasants often turned to the forest floor for their daily bread, gathering nuts that most modern folks would walk right past. Acorns and chestnuts in particular became crucial backup foods, turning the surrounding woodlands into a vast, emergency pantry. Chestnuts were the easier and more desirable of the two. Unlike acorns, chestnuts are naturally sweet and don't require extensive, laborious processing to become edible. In areas with large chestnut forests, especially across parts of France, Italy, and Spain, the chestnut tree became known as the bread tree because it provided a starchy, carbohydrate-rich food source very similar to grain. A good chestnut harvest could literally save a village from winter hunger. Their importance was so great that tax records from some medieval villages assessed a household's wealth not just by their land or livestock, but partly by how many chestnut trees they had access to. A single large chestnut tree could produce up to 200 pounds of nuts in a good year, enough to keep a family alive for weeks if their grain supply ran out. Medieval peasants prepared chestnuts in several ways. Roasting was the simplest. Just toss them in the hot ashes of the hearth until the shells cracked open. Boiling made them softer and easier to digest. For long-term storage, chestnuts were often dried and then ground into a coarse flour. This chestnut flour, while it didn't rise as well as wheat flour, could be mixed with whatever grain flour was available to stretch the bread supply, filling empty stomachs when it mattered most. Acorns, on the other hand, required much more work but could be true lifesavers during a famine. The bitter tannins in raw acorns make them completely inedible and mildly toxic. Over generations, peasants developed methods to remove these bitter compounds, usually by crushing the acorns and repeatedly soaking them in hot water, changing the water many times over several days. The process was long and used a lot of precious water and fuel, but the resulting acorn meal could be mixed with other flours to make a barely palatable but life-sustaining emergency bread. During the great famines that periodically struck Europe, like the devastating one from 1315 to 1317. These tree nuts became a primary food source. Court records from that time mention people getting into violent fights over access to nut-gathering grounds, showing just how valuable these forest foods became when all other options had disappeared. In the harshest times, even these forest staples might not be enough. That's when peasants turned to truly desperate measures, making food from things we would scarcely recognize as edible. The ash cake represented the absolute last line of defense against starvation, a type of primitive bread that could be made with minimal ingredients and zero kitchen tools. The concept was brutally simple. Take whatever ground meal you had, mix it with water to form a thick paste, flatten it into a patty, and cook it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. No oven, no baking stone, not even a pot was needed. Just fire, ash, and desperation. What made ash cakes so essential was their flexibility. When wheat and rye were gone, any ground grain would work. When all grain was gone, the definition of flour expanded dramatically to include ground acorns, dried and ground tree bark, crushed roots, or even dust and grain bits swept from the floor of an empty granary. The taste was about what you'd expect from bread baked in dirt, smoky, often bitter, and frequently gritty with actual ash. An old medieval joke claimed that ash cakes are the only food that tastes better if you drop them in the mud first, the mud presumably covering the unpleasant, ashy flavor. They weren't meant to be enjoyed. They were meant to get you through to the next sunrise. Ultimately, the best and most common medieval dish wasn't actually a dish at all. It was simply whatever bits and pieces happened to be around, thrown together in a pot and called dinner. Medieval peasants were masters of kitchen improvisation, centuries before it became trendy to clean out your fridge. This whatever we have approach wasn't a special occasion. It was daily life. In spring, it could be a handful of foraged wild greens tossed with the last of the winter turnips. In summer, a mix of garden vegetables with a tiny bit of bacon fat for flavor. In winter, it meant scraping by with whatever preserved foods remained. This flexible, resourceful, and often desperate way of eating developed out of necessity. It's a powerful reminder that for most of human history, the goal of cooking wasn't to create a culinary masterpiece, but to fill a hungry belly and provide enough energy to work another day. The best sauce, as a medieval French saying claimed, is hunger. Peasants living through the hardships of medieval life understood this better than anyone. Their creative approach to cooking with extremely limited resources wasn't just about survival. It was the original farm-to-table cuisine, shaped by the seasons, by poverty, and by remarkable and enduring human adaptability.